The research station on Epsilon 7 sat like a lonely metal crown on the jagged mountains. The planet's sky was a swirl of gray and orange clouds, constantly shifting and heavy with storms. Winds howled across the barren rocks, rattling the station's steel walls. Inside, it was warm but quiet, almost too quiet, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Doctor. Lyra Voss moved through the lab with careful precision. She adjusted the instruments on her bench, measuring tiny samples of alien soil and analyzing their chemical composition. The work required focus, concentration, and patience. She had long ago learned to avoid distractions, but here, the silence seemed heavier than anywhere else she had been. Lyra had always been good at her work. Her colleagues respected her skill, though few wanted to spend time with her. There was something in the way she moved, precise and reserved, that made others uncomfortable. She did not laugh at their jokes, did not linger in the common areas, and rarely engaged in casual conversation. In a station where human and alien cultures collided daily, that quiet distance made her appear strange. It was not that she did not want friends, it was that she had learned to survive without them. Epsilon 7 was harsh, and mistakes could cost lives. She focused on her experiments because they mattered, because science did not judge her for being different. The soil samples in her lab contained microscopic life forms, organisms that could survive extreme heat, acidic water, and crushing pressure. To understand them was to understand survival itself, a lesson she had learned well. Outside the lab, the station buzzed with activity. Crew members moved in and out of their compartments, carrying tools, data pads, or supplies, yet none of them approached her. She noticed the sideways glances, the hushed whispers when she passed. Some said she was too serious, too cold. Others said she was arrogant, though she had never raised her voice in anger. Still, the result was the same: she was left alone. Lyra did not mind. She preferred to work. But the loneliness was like a constant shadow. It crept into her mind during the quiet moments, whispering that maybe no one could truly understand her. She had grown used to it, but every so often it pressed against her chest, reminding her that even the most brilliant minds could feel isolated. The door to the lab slid open with a soft hiss. Lyra glanced up and saw a figure stepping inside. He wore the standard uniform of the maintenance team, a practical suit with reinforced joints for climbing and repairs. His hair was dark and slightly disheveled, his eyes calm but curious. He carried no data pad or tool in his hands, only a small box with parts. Lyra did not recognize him. The station had recently received new personnel, but she had not had cause to meet them. She watched silently as he moved toward the machinery at the far end of the lab, inspecting pipes and wires with careful attention. He did not speak, did not ask questions, and did not seem to notice her presence. She frowned. Most humans, most beings would have at least said hello. A greeting was basic courtesy, a recognition of existence. But this one did not speak. He simply worked methodically without acknowledgement of anyone else in the room. Curiosity stirred within her. She returned to her bench, pretending to focus on her instruments, but her eyes kept drifting toward him. He was adjusting a panel, testing circuits, making small repairs that she had not noticed before. Every movement was precise, efficient, almost silent. There was a rhythm to his work, a quiet confidence that was strangely comforting. Days passed. The human returned each morning, moving through the lab without a word. He never touched her samples directly, never interfered with her experiments, yet somehow everything ran smoother. Equipment seemed better calibrated, minor faults repaired before they could become major problems. Lyra began to notice patterns, subtle improvements that made her work easier and more reliable. She was not sure why it mattered so much. Perhaps it was the realization that someone was paying attention, someone who did not judge her for her quiet ways. Perhaps it was the mystery of it, the way he appeared at exactly the right moment to prevent small disasters. She could not name the feeling, only that it was new, and it made her heart beat a little faster. Other crew members continued to avoid her. They whispered about the human engineer, questioning why he spent so much time in her lab. "Does he like her?" one asked. "Or is he just different?" Another shook their head. "Humans don't usually work this quietly. It's unsettling." What mattered were facts, the results of experiments, the integrity of her work, and now, the quiet presence of the engineer who fixed things before she even noticed they were broken. One evening, a storm struck. The winds outside the station screamed against the metal walls, and the power grid flickered under the strain. Alarms rang softly in the lab, and Lyra's instruments began to display error messages. She rushed to stabilize the environment, adjusting temperature controls, rerouting power, and monitoring oxygen levels. She was exhausted, her hands shaking slightly from the tension. A critical sample, weeks in preparation, teetered on the edge of ruin. She cursed under her breath, knowing that if she failed, months of work would be lost. The human engineer appeared at her side without a word. He carried a small toolkit and knelt beside a power junction, fingers moving quickly and confidently. Lyra watched, momentarily stunned. He made adjustments with care, rewiring circuits, stabilizing the system. Within minutes, the alarms ceased. The lights returned to normal and the instruments resumed their readings as if nothing had happened. Lyra exhaled, the tension leaving her body in a rush. She did not know whether to thank him, to speak, or to simply retreat. He looked at her for a moment, then returned to his work, silent as before. That night she could not sleep. She lay in her compartment, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the human who had entered her world without permission, without words, and had somehow understood exactly what she needed. There was no explanation, no conversation, only action. And yet the impact was undeniable. The following days passed in similar rhythm. Lyra worked, the engineer repaired, and slowly the station felt less like a prison. Small things changed. Equipment never failed at the worst moment, experiments ran smoother, and Lyra's isolation felt less oppressive. She began to anticipate his presence, noticing him before he entered the room, feeling a strange sense of reassurance in knowing he would be there. One afternoon, she left her bench to check the storage units. The storm outside had left the station eerily quiet. She found him already at work on a pressure regulator, his back to her. She watched silently, not wanting to disturb the rhythm. He adjusted the machine, nodded once to himself, and moved on to the next task, unaware that she was observing. Lyra realized something important. Connection did not always need words. Trust did not always require conversation. She had spent years alone, believing that no one could understand her, that she must carry her burdens in silence. Yet here was proof that understanding could exist in actions, in presence, in the quiet certainty of someone who simply did what was needed. She smiled faintly to herself, a gesture she rarely allowed. For the first time in a long while, the weight of loneliness felt lighter. She returned to her bench, her hands steady, her mind clear. The experiments proceeded flawlessly, as if the station itself had begun to cooperate. Days turned into weeks. The stormy planet remained harsh and unforgiving, but inside the station, a subtle shift had occurred. Lyra no longer felt completely isolated. She had a companion, though she did not know his name, though he spoke no words. The human engineer had entered her life quietly, without ceremony, without expectation, and yet his presence was undeniable. And so, life continued on Epsilon 7. Lyra focused on her research, discovering new organisms and unraveling mysteries of survival in extreme conditions. The engineer worked beside her silently, his actions speaking louder than any words could. The other crew members remained distant, unsure of how to approach the unusual partnership forming in the lab. But it did not matter. For the first time in years, Lyra felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that she was not entirely alone in the universe. As another storm raged outside, she paused and looked toward the lab's entrance, half expecting him to appear. She knew he would, and she knew she would not have to ask for help. That was the remarkable thing, he understood without explanation. The weight of solitude had begun to lift, replaced by the quiet certainty that sometimes, the simplest gestures, the smallest acts of presence, could mean more than words ever could. And in that understanding, Lyra found the first spark of connection in a world that had once seemed entirely indifferent. The days on Epsilon 7 had a rhythm that was both harsh and predictable. The storms outside lashed the station with wind and dust, shaking the walls and rattling the equipment, yet inside, life carried on with careful, deliberate steps. Dr. Lyra Voss had grown accustomed to the constant hum of machines and the faint vibration beneath her feet. It was a sound she could depend on, unlike the whispers of the other crew members, which she had long learned to ignore. The human engineer continued to appear each day. He moved quietly through the lab, checking machinery, adjusting pressure valves, tightening loose bolts. He did not speak, did not announce his presence, yet his work was evident. Experiments ran smoother, and the minor malfunctions that had once frustrated Lyra were now almost non-existent. She had begun to notice small patterns, how he seemed to appear just when she needed a system stabilized, how the equipment always seemed to operate better after he had worked on it. Lyra had no idea why he did it. Perhaps it was habit, training, or an instinct she could not understand. But she appreciated it more than she could say. The presence of another being, silent but attentive, brought a strange comfort she had not known for years. She was no longer alone in her work, and that realization gave her a quiet sense of hope. One morning, Lyra found herself at the soil analysis station, her eyes scanning a microscope sample. A storm outside had caused minor fluctuations in the station's power supply, and she had been worried about the integrity of her samples. She noticed immediately that everything was functioning perfectly. The sensors were calibrated, the instruments aligned, and the temperature controls stable. She looked up, almost expecting to see the engineer, though she knew he had not announced his arrival. He was standing at the edge of the room, quietly adjusting a small machine. He caught her glance for a brief moment, then returned to his work. Lyra felt a strange mixture of curiosity and gratitude. She had never been good at expressing emotions through words, but this silent exchange carried more meaning than any conversation could. Other crew members had begun to notice the changes as well. Some whispered among themselves about the human engineer, questioning his methods and his quiet presence. "He never talks to anyone," one remarked. "How do we even know he is doing his job correctly?" Another crew member shook their head. "Humans are strange. They act differently from anyone else here. It is unsettling." She had learned long ago that people could say many things, but it was what they did that mattered. And this human had shown, day after day, that he understood her work, the station, and perhaps even her without ever speaking a word. A few days later, a minor emergency struck. One of the life support units had begun to fail. The air pressure fluctuated, and sensors warned of a potential oxygen drop. Lyra moved quickly, adjusting the valves, rerouting power, and trying to stabilize the system. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but the situation was complex, and she knew she could not do it alone. The human engineer appeared beside her, silently opening a maintenance panel. He moved with confidence, adjusting circuits and valves, his actions precise and deliberate. Lyra observed him closely, feeling a strange sense of reassurance. Together, though without speaking, they managed to stabilize the system. The oxygen levels returned to normal, and the alarms ceased. For the first time, Lyra allowed herself to study him more carefully. His movements were deliberate but unhurried, efficient but careful. He did not rush or make mistakes. There was a rhythm to his work, a natural understanding of the station and its systems. It was as if he had anticipated the emergency before it even occurred. Lyra realized that she was beginning to rely on him, not just for technical help, but for the quiet sense of support he provided. She did not need words to feel his presence. His actions spoke volumes. And yet she also realized that she did not know anything about him. She did not know his name, his past, or even why he had come to the station. The silence between them had become a language of its own. Lyra learned to recognize his small gestures, a hand on a panel, a careful adjustment of a sensor, a glance toward her instruments. She began to leave subtle signs for him as well, small indications of what needed attention or adjustment. It was a silent collaboration, a dance of unspoken understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon of Epsilon 7, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and gray, Lyra worked late in the lab. The storm outside had subsided, leaving a quiet stillness. She was organizing her data when she noticed the human engineer approaching. He carried a small toolbox, moving slowly and deliberately. Without a word, he knelt beside a console that had been giving her trouble for weeks. His fingers moved quickly, adjusting wires and replacing components. Lyra watched silently, fascinated by the ease and precision of his movements. Within minutes, the console was functioning perfectly. She realized that this minor improvement would save her hours of frustration in the future. She wanted to speak to thank him, to ask why he helped her so consistently, but the words would not come. Instead, she simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude. The engineer glanced at her briefly, then continued with his work, silent and focused. Over the next few days, their routine continued. Lyra immersed herself in her research, analyzing new samples and recording her observations. The human engineer moved quietly through the lab, repairing, adjusting, and improving. Their collaboration, though silent, became increasingly efficient. Lyra began to anticipate his presence, knowing when he would appear and what he would do. It was not just technical assistance that he provided. His presence offered a strange sense of stability in the midst of the station's constant challenges. Lyra found herself less tense, more confident in her work. The isolation that had once weighed heavily on her seemed to ease, replaced by a quiet reassurance. The other crew members continued to watch with curiosity. Some were skeptical, others intrigued. They began to notice the changes in Lyra as well. She moved with more confidence, her experiments were more successful, and her quiet demeanor no longer seemed as intimidating. The silent partnership between her and the engineer was having a subtle but undeniable effect. One day, while Lyra was preparing a new set of samples, a small error occurred in the climate control system. The temperature in the lab began to rise, threatening to damage her delicate specimens. She moved quickly to adjust the system, but the problem was complex. Before she could react further, the human engineer appeared at her side. Without a word, he began to work on the controls. His hands moved with skill and precision, adjusting settings, rerouting power, and stabilizing the temperature. Lyra watched, her admiration growing with each movement. Together, though without speaking, they managed to save the samples. For a moment, Lyra allowed herself to feel a sense of connection. She realized that words were not necessary to communicate understanding, trust, or support. The engineer's presence, his careful attention to her work and the station, conveyed all of these things. She felt a quiet gratitude that was deeper than anything she had experienced before. As the days passed, the stormy skies of Epsilon 7 continued to rage outside, but inside the station, life felt steadier. Lyra continued her research, and the human engineer continued his silent work. They had established a rhythm, a partnership built on unspoken understanding. Lyra began to notice small details about him, how he approached tasks with patience, how he seemed to anticipate problems before they occurred, and how he respected her space and her work. It was a rare and unusual presence in a world that often demanded attention and recognition. She wondered what had brought him to the station. Was he always this quiet and attentive? Or had he learned to adapt to the unique challenges of life on Epsilon 7? She did not know, and she realized that she did not need to. His actions spoke clearly enough. One evening, as the sky darkened and the winds howled outside, Lyra stood by the window, watching the dust swirl across the barren landscape. The station was quiet, the hum of machines the only sound. She thought about the human engineer, about the silent partnership they had formed, and about the subtle changes that had taken place in her own life. For the first time, she felt a sense of possibility. Perhaps connection did not require words. Perhaps understanding could exist in action and presence alone. And perhaps, even in a harsh and unforgiving world, there could be moments of quiet companionship that were more powerful than any conversation. She turned back to her lab, ready to continue her work. The samples awaited her attention, and the station needed care. The human engineer was there, as always, moving silently, ensuring that everything functioned smoothly. Lyra felt a quiet sense of reassurance, a knowledge that she was no longer entirely alone. And in that knowledge, she found a spark of hope. The world outside was still stormy and dangerous, but inside the lab there was a new rhythm, a rhythm of understanding, trust, and quiet collaboration. It was a beginning, and Lyra knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the silent support of the human engineer, without words, without ceremony, but with unwavering presence. The storms on Epsilon 7 had grown worse. The winds were no longer merely a background howl. They struck the station with sudden bursts of force, rattling panels and shaking windows. The red-orange sky was filled with swirling dust, making the planet's surface almost invisible. Inside, the station vibrated with every gust, and the crew knew they had to remain alert. Dr. Lyra Voss moved quickly through the lab, carrying a tray of sensitive samples. The instruments beeped softly, warning of minor fluctuations in temperature and air pressure. She adjusted the climate controls, her hands steady despite the tension. Every shift of the wind outside threatened the fragile balance of life inside the station. The xenobiology work she conducted required extreme precision. One misstep could ruin weeks of research. She paused to check a monitor, her eyes scanning lines of data. That's when she noticed a drop in the oxygen circulation system. A small reading, barely noticeable at first, but enough to cause concern. She moved to stabilize it, rerouting power and checking valves. Despite her skill, the problem was complex. Her mind raced through the possible causes, blocked conduits, sensor malfunction, or damage caused by the storm outside. Before panic could set in, she felt the presence of the human engineer. He appeared silently, kneeling beside the main console without announcement. His hands moved quickly over the panels, adjusting circuits and checking connections. Lyra watched, her chest tightening not with fear but with a strange reassurance. She had seen him act this way before, silently, efficiently, and with perfect timing. Together they worked in unspoken coordination. Lyra monitored the oxygen levels while he rewired the failing system. The minutes stretched, every second weighted with importance. Outside, the winds howled louder, rattling the station's walls as if they were about to collapse. Inside, their silent teamwork was the only thing keeping the lab alive. Finally, the oxygen circulation stabilized. The warning lights turned off and the instruments returned to normal. Lyra exhaled slowly, feeling the tension leave her body in a rush. She looked at the engineer, but he did not meet her eyes. He simply moved to the next task, checking other systems with the same quiet efficiency. For a moment, she let herself appreciate the strange bond they shared. No words were necessary. He understood what she needed and acted without question. She realized that, for the first time in years, she had a partner in this harsh, isolated world. A partner who did not judge, who did not demand, who simply acted with clarity and skill. The rest of the crew continued to be distant. They noticed the engineer's presence but had no idea how to interpret it. Some whispered about his strange silence, others about his unusual efficiency. "He never speaks, never asks questions," one remarked. "He is almost too perfect." Another nodded. "Humans are strange," they said. "They think differently from anyone else here." And this human had demonstrated repeatedly that understanding could exist in motion, in timing, and in the quiet care he showed for both her work and the station itself. The following day brought a new challenge. A minor quake, triggered by shifting tectonic plates, shook the station. Panels loosened, wires came undone, and a coolant system began to fail. Lyra rushed to stabilize her lab while monitoring the instruments. Her hands moved quickly, rerouting circuits and adjusting temperatures. The quake was unpredictable, and the damage spread faster than she could track. Once again, the engineer appeared silently. He knelt beside a broken panel, carefully reconnecting wires and calibrating the systems. Lyra adjusted valves and checked samples, their work flowing together in perfect, unspoken harmony. It was as if they were two halves of the same mind, responding to the situation without need for words. Hours passed, the quake subsided, and the lab stabilized. Lyra finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She looked at the engineer, her eyes searching for some sign of acknowledgement. He gave nothing but a small nod before moving on to another console. Yet she felt a surge of respect and gratitude stronger than anything she had experienced before. She realized that their partnership had grown beyond simple assistance. He was not just fixing systems. He was enhancing her ability to work, protecting her research, and in his quiet way, offering companionship. The station no longer felt entirely hostile. There was a rhythm now, a silent understanding that made even the harshest moments bearable. That evening, as the storm outside calmed but the wind still rattled the station, Lyra continued her research. She examined new soil samples, studying microscopic organisms that survived in extreme conditions. The work fascinated her, but she noticed how her mind was less burdened by worry. The engineer's presence had become a stabilizing force. She could focus entirely on her experiments, knowing that he would silently manage the systems around her. She began leaving subtle signs for him. A small adjustment to a valve here, a note taped to a console there, indicating what needed attention. It was not a direct communication, but he understood. Each morning, she found that the system had been fine-tuned in ways she could not have anticipated. Slowly, a silent conversation developed, built entirely on actions and observation. Other crew members began to notice the change in her as well. She moved with more confidence, her work was smoother, and she carried herself with an unspoken authority. Whispers about the human engineer's strange behavior continued, but Lyra no longer cared. She understood what he brought to the station: skill, reliability, and quiet understanding. One night, a major emergency struck. A sudden energy surge caused a reactor panel to overload, threatening to disable the entire station. The alarms blared, red lights flashing across every corridor. Lyra raced to the main lab, her heart pounding. Without the engineer's help, the station could be in danger, and her research could be destroyed. He was already there, kneeling beside the reactor panel, his hands moving with precision. Lyra joined him, adjusting cooling valves and monitoring the power flow. The surge was unpredictable, fluctuating in intensity, but together they managed to stabilize it. The lights dimmed, the alarms ceased, and the station hummed steadily once more. For the first time, Lyra felt a profound sense of trust. She did not need to question his motives or his abilities. He had proven through countless silent actions that he could be relied upon in even the most dangerous situations. And she realized that trust, once earned, was more powerful than words. The engineer did not look at her or speak. He simply moved on to check other systems, as if the emergency had never happened. Lyra watched him, her admiration growing. She had encountered many beings in her life, but none had demonstrated the combination of skill, courage, and quiet presence that he possessed. In the days that followed, the stormy weather outside continued, but the station functioned smoothly. Lyra's research progressed without interruption, her samples safe, her experiments precise. The engineer continued his silent work, his actions a constant reassurance in a world that could feel unpredictable and dangerous. Lyra began to feel something she had not felt in years, a sense of partnership. She had always worked alone, relying solely on her own skills and judgment. But now she realized that collaboration did not require conversation, nor did it demand recognition. It could exist entirely in action, in timing, in shared understanding. One afternoon, as she observed a particularly delicate specimen under the microscope, she noticed the engineer adjusting a nearby machine. She paused, realizing that his work had improved the efficiency of her analysis. Without speaking, he had enhanced her ability to succeed. She felt a deep sense of respect for him and a quiet gratitude that filled a space she had long believed empty. Outside the lab, the station hummed with quiet activity. Other crew members went about their duties, noticing the changes in Lyra but unsure how to interpret them. They whispered about the human engineer, speculating about his intentions and methods. Yet Lyra paid them no mind. She knew the truth. Understanding could exist without words, trust could be built through action, and connection could flourish silently. As another storm raged outside, Lyra stood by a window, watching the swirling dust and lightning in the distance. She thought about the human engineer, about the countless times he had appeared at exactly the right moment to prevent disaster. She realized that his presence had changed something within her, not just her work, but her perspective on companionship, trust, and the subtle power of quiet action. She returned to her bench, her hands steady, her mind clear. The samples awaited her attention, and the station required constant care. The engineer was there, as always, moving silently, ensuring that everything functioned perfectly. Lyra felt a profound sense of reassurance, knowing that she was no longer alone in her work or in her isolation. And in that knowledge, she discovered something remarkable. Even in a harsh, unforgiving world, the smallest acts of understanding, the quietest gestures of support, could create bonds stronger than words, stronger than expectations, stronger than the storms that raged outside. The human engineer had come without a word, without ceremony, without seeking recognition. And in doing so, he had changed everything. Lyra returned to her work, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The storms outside continued to rage, but inside the lab there was a new order, a new rhythm, and a new hope. She was no longer alone. She had a silent partner, a quiet guardian, and a living reminder that understanding and courage could transcend language, culture, and distance. For the first time in her career on Epsilon 7, Lyra felt truly capable, not just as a scientist, but as a human being learning to trust, to accept help, and to find companionship in the most unexpected form. The lab hummed with life, the instruments sang their quiet song of precision, and the human engineer continued his work without a word. And Lyra, standing amidst the delicate balance of science and survival, felt a sense of peace that had long eluded her. She had learned in the silence of his presence the extraordinary power of quiet action. The storms on Epsilon 7 had grown relentless. Each day, the winds slammed against the station, shaking the walls and rattling the reinforced panels. Lightning split the sky in brilliant flashes of orange and red, illuminating the jagged mountains outside. Inside the station, the hum of machinery was a constant reassurance, though the crew knew the planet could challenge even the strongest systems. Dr. Lyra Voss moved through her lab, checking each instrument carefully. The soil samples on her bench were delicate, containing organisms that survived extreme temperatures and corrosive conditions. She had spent weeks studying them, noting every reaction, every change, every growth pattern. One false reading, one malfunction, and months of work could be lost. She paused at a monitor and frowned. Readings from the life support system were fluctuating again. The storms outside had triggered minor surges, affecting the station's oxygen circulation. Lyra quickly checked the valves, rerouted power to the backup system, and monitored the pressure gauges. Despite her careful work, the fluctuations persisted and her heart sank with worry. Then she sensed the familiar presence. The human engineer had arrived, moving silently across the lab. He carried a small toolkit and knelt beside a panel that controlled the oxygen distribution. His hands moved quickly but deliberately, adjusting wires, recalibrating sensors, and stabilizing the system. Lyra watched, her chest tightening with a mix of admiration and relief. They did not speak. They did not need to. In their silence, a rhythm had formed, an unspoken understanding that allowed them to work together efficiently. Lyra monitored the readings while he adjusted the machinery, their actions perfectly synchronized. Each movement, each adjustment, communicated volumes without a single word. Outside, the storm intensified. The wind slammed against the station, shaking it violently, and a sudden power surge caused several lights to flicker. Lyra's heart skipped a beat as alarms began to sound across the station. She raced to the main console, her mind calculating every step she needed to take to stabilize the systems. The engineer was already there. He moved with calm precision, kneeling beside the power junctions and adjusting connections. Lyra followed, working on the environmental controls while he stabilized the station's electrical network. Every second counted. A delay could result in the failure of critical systems, endangering both the crew and her research. Minutes stretched into tense hours. Sweat ran down Lyra's face as she focused on the delicate controls of her lab. She had never experienced a storm like this before, one that threatened not only the experiments but the very survival of the station. The engineer remained calm, methodically addressing each issue, his silent presence giving her strength and confidence. Finally, the alarm ceased. The lights stabilized, and the hum of machinery returned to its steady rhythm. Lyra exhaled, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease. She looked at the engineer, but he did not meet her eyes. He simply moved on to check another panel, as if the crisis had never happened. For the first time, Lyra felt a profound sense of trust. She realized that she could rely on him not only for technical expertise, but also for his steady presence in the face of danger. She had spent years alone, navigating challenges without help, but now she understood the power of silent partnership. The storm outside did not abate, but inside the lab, Lyra and the engineer worked in harmony. She began to notice how he anticipated problems before they occurred, how he moved efficiently from one task to another, and how he seemed to understand the station and its systems better than anyone else. It was as if he had a connection to the technology itself, an intuition that allowed him to act decisively in critical moments. Lyra realized that she was learning from him. His actions taught her to anticipate challenges, to remain calm under pressure, and to trust in the reliability of others. She had always been self-reliant, but now she saw the value of collaboration, even silent collaboration, in achieving success. Over the next few days, the station experienced a series of smaller emergencies: a minor power surge, a cooling system failure, a fluctuation in oxygen levels. Each time, the engineer appeared without announcement, addressing the problem quickly and efficiently. Lyra worked alongside him, and together they managed to maintain stability. Their unspoken partnership had become a lifeline, allowing them to handle challenges that would have overwhelmed a single person. Other crew members began to notice the changes. They saw Lyra moving with more confidence, handling equipment with precision, and rarely showing signs of stress. Whispers about the human engineer continued, but now there was curiosity and admiration mixed with the skepticism. "He never speaks," one remarked, "and yet he seems to solve every problem before it becomes serious." Another nodded. "Humans are remarkable. They think differently, and sometimes that difference saves lives." Words had never mattered as much as action, and the engineer had proven that understanding, trust, and support could exist entirely in silence. She focused on her research, now with a sense of calm and confidence she had never felt before. One afternoon, while studying a new soil sample, Lyra noticed a small anomaly in her readings. A chemical reaction was occurring faster than expected, threatening to compromise the experiment. She moved quickly to stabilize it, adjusting the temperature and humidity in the chamber. Just as she finished, the engineer appeared, kneeling beside the control panel and fine-tuning the system further. Together, they managed to save the experiment. Lyra realized that their partnership had become more than just practical assistance. It was a silent communication, a shared understanding that allowed them to work in harmony. She felt a deep sense of respect and gratitude for him, though she did not know his name, his past, or why he had come to the station. It did not matter. His actions spoke louder than words could ever express. That night, as the storm raged on, Lyra found herself unable to sleep. She stood by the observation window, watching the orange and red sky, the swirling dust, and the flashes of lightning. She thought about the engineer, about the countless times he had appeared at exactly the right moment to prevent disaster. She realized that his presence had changed something within her. For years, she had believed that solitude was necessary for survival, that trust was a luxury she could not afford. But now she understood that partnership, even a silent one, could be just as vital as skill, knowledge, or experience. She felt a new sense of hope, a recognition that connection could exist without words, and that courage and understanding could be expressed through actions alone. The next morning, the station faced another challenge. A minor quake shook the foundations, loosening panels and causing minor structural damage. Lyra rushed to her lab, checking samples and monitoring systems. The engineer appeared beside her, silently assessing the damage and beginning repairs. Their work flowed together seamlessly, each anticipating the other's actions, each responding instinctively to the station's needs. Hours passed as they repaired and stabilized the systems. The storm outside continued, the winds battering the station and rattling the walls. Lyra's hands were sore, her body tired, but she felt an unshakable sense of purpose. With the engineer at her side, she could face any challenge. Together, they maintained the balance of life, research, and survival on Epsilon 7. By evening, the storm had subsided slightly, leaving a calm that felt almost unnatural after days of chaos. Lyra stood by the lab bench, examining the final readings of her experiments. The results were better than she had hoped. The samples were stable, the instruments perfectly calibrated, and the station functioning at optimal levels. She looked at the engineer, who was silently moving between panels, making final adjustments. She wanted to speak, to ask his name, to understand why he had come to her lab and helped her so consistently. But she realized that words were unnecessary. The trust, the understanding, and the partnership had already been established through countless actions, through the rhythm of shared work, and through the quiet reliability he had shown. Lyra understood something important. True connection did not always require conversation. Trust could be built through action, respect could be demonstrated without words, and courage could be expressed in silent, deliberate deeds. The engineer had shown all of these qualities, and in doing so, he had become an indispensable presence in her life. That night, as the station settled into a fragile peace, Lyra allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about the storms outside, the dangers of the planet, and the challenges of her work. She thought about the engineer, about his silent dedication and unwavering skill. And she felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for his help, but for the lesson he had taught her. That understanding, partnership, and courage could exist in quiet actions, without expectation or recognition. For the first time, she felt truly capable, not just as a scientist, but as someone who could trust, rely on others, and face the unknown with confidence. The storms of Epsilon 7 would continue to rage, but she was no longer alone. She had a partner, a silent ally, and a living example of the extraordinary capabilities of humans. As the night deepened, Lyra returned to her research, her hands steady, her mind clear. The lab hummed with life, the instruments precise and reliable, and the engineer continued his work without a word. Together, they maintained the delicate balance of survival, science, and understanding in a world that was both beautiful and unforgiving. And in that quiet partnership, Lyra found a new kind of strength, one that would carry her through the storms yet to come. The human engineer had arrived without a word, had worked beside her without recognition, and had shown her the power of silent courage, understanding, and reliability. In doing so, he had changed her world entirely. The calm after the storm on Epsilon 7 did not last long. The planet was never kind for extended periods, and the crew had learned that silence often meant danger was coming. The sky outside the station darkened again, clouds folding over each other like heavy waves. Sensors across the station began to flash warnings, not loud alarms yet, but quiet signals that something large was forming far beyond the mountains. Doctor. Lyra Voss stood in her lab, reviewing data from her latest samples. The organisms she studied had adapted to pressure and heat beyond normal limits. They survived because they adjusted quickly, because they did not waste energy, and because they worked together in ways she was still trying to understand. She paused, realizing how closely their survival mirrored her own life on the station. A low vibration moved through the floor. Lyra felt it before she heard anything. She placed her hand on the lab bench to steady herself. The vibration grew stronger, followed by a sharp alert from the central system. This time, the warning was clear. A massive planetary storm was forming, larger than any the station had faced since its construction. Across the station, crew members rushed to their posts. Doors sealed automatically, backup systems powered on. The air felt tense, heavy with uncertainty. Lyra's heart beat faster, but her hands remained steady. She had learned to stay calm under pressure. She was not alone anymore. The human engineer was already there. He stood near the main control panel, scanning the readouts, his face focused and calm. Without a word, he began opening access panels, checking power distribution lines, reinforcing systems that would take the strongest impact. Lyra moved beside him, monitoring environmental controls and protecting her research. They did not look at each other, but they were aware of every movement the other made. The storm struck faster than expected. Winds slammed into the station with terrifying force. The entire structure shook, metal groaning under pressure. Lights flickered. A deep rumble echoed through the halls as external shields struggled to hold. Several systems failed at once, overwhelming the automated controls. Alarms filled the station. Lyra's lab screens flashed red. Temperature rose rapidly, threatening to destroy the samples she had worked on for months. She moved quickly, shutting down non-essential systems, redirecting power, sealing containment units. Her breathing stayed even, though fear pressed against her chest. The engineer knelt beside a damaged power junction, sparks flying as he worked. He used his own body to shield exposed wiring, adjusting circuits with careful precision. The storm outside roared like a living thing, trying to tear the station apart. A sudden impact threw Lyra against the wall. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she pushed herself upright. One of the main structural supports had shifted. If it failed, the lab could decompress. She looked at the engineer. For the first time since they had met, he met her eyes. There were no words. None were needed. They moved together. Lyra stabilized the pressure controls while the engineer reinforced the damaged support manually, using emergency materials and raw strength. The station shook violently, but he did not hesitate. His movements were fast, controlled, and fearless. He worked as if failure was not an option. Minutes felt like hours. The storm reached its peak. Winds howled, lightning struck nearby rock formations, and seismic waves rippled beneath the station. The entire crew waited, holding their breath, trusting systems they could not see and people they barely knew. Then slowly the vibrations eased. The alarms quieted, the lights stabilized, the storm passed. Inside the lab, silence returned, broken only by the soft hum of machines. Lyra leaned against the bench, her body trembling now that the danger had passed. She checked the monitors. The samples were safe. The systems were stable. The station had survived. She turned to the engineer. He was sitting on the floor, back against the wall, breathing steadily. His hands were scraped, his uniform damaged, but his expression was calm. He had done more than protect machines. He had protected lives. Lyra lowered herself onto a nearby chair, exhaustion washing over her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly she stood and walked toward the small seating area near the lab window. It was a place no one ever used. A single bench faced the harsh landscape outside. She had always sat there alone if she sat there at all. She paused. Then she gestured toward the empty space beside her. The engineer looked at her, surprised for the first time. He stood, hesitated briefly, then walked over and sat beside her. They did not speak. Outside, the sky began to clear. Dust settled. The mountains stood quiet again, unchanged and indifferent. Inside the station, life continued. Crew members moved through corridors, checking damage, repairing systems, grateful to still be alive. Word spread quickly. The human engineer who never spoke had saved the station. Crew members who once whispered now watched him with respect. Some nodded when he passed. Others stepped aside, offering silent acknowledgement. They did not need explanations. They had seen the results. Lyra sat beside him, looking out at the horizon. For the first time since arriving on Epsilon 7, she did not feel like an outsider. She did not feel invisible. She understood something important now. Humans did not always show strength through loud words or bold claims. Sometimes their greatest power was in quiet action, in showing up when it mattered, in doing what needed to be done without asking for recognition. The engineer stood after a while, returning to his work as if nothing had changed. But everything had. In the days that followed, the station repaired itself. Systems improved, procedures changed. Lyra's research gained new importance, helping develop stronger materials and survival methods inspired by the organisms she studied. And the human engineer, he continued working quietly. But now, someone always sat beside Lyra during meals. The empty space was gone. The station on Epsilon 7 became known for something rare, not just survival but cooperation. A place where silence was not weakness and understanding did not require words. Lyra returned to her lab each day with renewed purpose. She worked not in isolation but in quiet partnership. She had learned that connection could be simple, trust could be silent, and strength could exist without being announced. No one had sat beside her for a long time, until the human engineer did, without a word, and that, she realized, had changed everything.